Epilogue Chapter 8. It was pleasant out. The granary lights were blue and bronze, brushing softly against the pavement stones, and a breeze too soft to push against the morning mist trailed down the street. If Song were a fortunate woman, she would be sitting in the delightful garden terrace of the Emerald Vaults, sipping at a cup of Jagong green as she waited for Angharay to join her so she might give a full report over her evening at the old playhouse. They might share some of the honey bread Song had heard so much about from Uncle Zhuge, perhaps even have a word about the tension with Mariam while waiting on her to return from the Akeller chapter house. But the Wren were cursed, beloved only of misery, so instead she was headed to a detainment house to get Tristan fucking a Brascal out of it. The watch did not call it a jail, which was a bomb on her heart, as if a member of her brigade had gotten thrown into jail before classes even began. Song might just have to throw herself into Elysee Bay to end this debacle early and spare herself further indignity. A god-for opponent could be overcome, but not a pig teammate. Only the thought that this might not be of the thief's fault kept her from growing too furious with a Brascal, who might have been the victim in whatever affair saw him tossed into not to jail. A Brascal deserved a fair hearing, regardless of her concerns about the man. The same watch clerk to tell her he had never come back last night had been kind enough to give her directions to the detainment house that had sent word they had him, so at 5:45 sharp she showed up at its door dressed neatly, freshly bathed and combed with her coat buttons polished. From the outside the building looked more akin to an inn than some jail, save for the two half-asleep watchmen lounging by the door. They straightened when she approached, though their gazes remained bored. Plack, the taller of the two, asked. Wordlessly she presented the silver seal, which the watchman examined before giving back. 13th, huh? He snickered. Lucky you. You're here for the kid that ended up on the wrong side of a red line? Tristan a Brascal, I am going to murder you, she swore. Gods and circle, could you really not make it a single day? I am sure it is only a misunderstanding. Song lied, smiling politely. May I enter? The guard lazily waved her in. The Tianxi found that her earlier impression had some truth to it. The building had clearly been an inn at some point in the past. The common room seemed much the same as before, though stripped of some tables in favor of weapons racks, and what must have been the rooms for lodging in the back were now for holding students under arrest. Inside, a handful of Blascloaks sat at the table by the hearth, two of them reading while others chatted over steaming mugs of tea. One of them, a woman of Someshwari looks, glanced back and then rose at the sight of her. 13th. She asked. Curl accent, Song noticed. Unusual, as that mountain people rarely left the continent, but some were said to turn to mercenary work during lean years, and the watch recruited heavily from soldiers of fortune, both the garrison and the free companies. I am Captain Song Ren of the 13th Brigade, she confirmed. Here for Tristan a Brascal. Leftmost room, the Someshwari said. He's with Sergeant Hoddle, you can go right in. Song nodded her thanks, then moved to put an end to this mess as quickly as possible. She was but a few feet away from the door when she heard a Brascal shout from inside, jaw tightening in quicksilver anger. It was one thing to hold a member of her cabal, another to beat them. That would not be tolerated. Hand on the chisel, Song reminded herself, but wrenched open the door harder than necessary. Only to be faced with a Brascal sitting with Sergeant Hoddle over a game of cards, moaning as he lost a hand to the Aslan Blascloak. Loudly enough neither noticed her arrival. His calamity god was lounging against the wall, able to look at Hoddle's cards, though such a thing was no doubt beneath her. A Brascal had been shouting at his loss, not a beating, and so the world was righted. Song was allowed to be furious at him once more. 3 valets? Tristan groaned. The torture rack would have been kinder. Do not tempt me, Song coldly said, entering and closing the door behind her. At last they noticed her, Sergeant Hoddle chuckling and a Brascal straightening like a child caught pilfering sweets. The gray-eyed man shot her what he must think was a winning smile, which had her tightening her jaw. She hated that most about him, the way he played it all off, as if it were a game, a jest. As if this situation was not deadly serious, a potential black mark on their cabal's reputation they might be working off for months. Your plaque? Sergeant Hoddle asked, leaning back in his chair. Song dutifully handed it, glancing lightly above Huddle's head at the rows of golden letters hovering there and further unfolding beneath her gaze. Written in Sensen, not a metal, so easy enough to read. She only had moments to peek at his terms before he returned the plaque, but it was enough to glean that the contract seemed to concern memory. Sergeant Huddle, it's Gwyn Huddle, she learned through the terms, asked for her name and nodded after receiving it. Your man here is in detainment for being found past a red line by one of the Western patrols, Captain Song, the sergeant told her. He told his tale of how he got there and it seems to check out with an accidental crossing. We had the details investigated. Song, standing ramrod straight before the two, bent her neck to nod. Am I to understand that an accidental crossing is a lesser offense than willful one? She asked. It's not an offense at all, Sergeant Huddle said. He has been detained because while he passed a Judas test he could have been brain-bent. He's spent a night contained without going into a mania episode, however, so that doesn't appear to be the case. The Judas test, Song had read, was one of the Watch's means to determine if someone had been possessed. 66 seconds exposed to Brunel silver, a metal that induced allergic reactions on the flesh of individuals ridden by gods. That explained why their brigade plaque was silvery, though it must be an alloy. Brunel silver was wildly expensive, but now why Tristan had needed to be tested for possession in the first place. That interrogation could wait, Song decided. He is cleared of risks, then, she said. He is, Sergeant Huddle conceded. She glanced at Tristan. Up, she ordered. You can attempt to convince me this was not your fault over breakfast. He was thoroughly undeserving of the Emerald Vault's honey bread, but the world was an unfair place and she would not deny herself petty pleasures. Only the thief did not move and Huddle cocked an eyebrow at her. Your man is also the reason 2 students are in the hospital, the watchman said. He's not going anywhere until your patron comes to collect him. Song turned to look at Abraskal, silently demanding an explanation. The second's not even my fault, really, he complained. The house collapsed and the man got hit by loose masonry standing in the street like a fool. The house collapsed because you threw a grenade at the roof, Sergeant Huddle reminded him. It was evidently not the first time they'd had this conversation. Abraskal's calamity god, whose name burned Song's eyes even to glance at when she glanced at the hovering contract, was laughing at something. Perhaps glee at violence done in her name. It was just fireworks, which I threw at a Skiritai student, Abraskal peevishly said. And he's just fine, you told me, even though he was blinded, deaf and on the roof when it fell. I threw the damn thing and still got bruises. The thief glanced at her. It's unfair that other people also get to have it, Tredegar, the gray-eyed man seriously told her. I much preferred it when we had a monopoly on that sort of thing. Song always disliked it when she agreed with something he said. It made her feel like she had joined a particularly embarrassing circus. The Tianxi cleared her throat. Our patron has yet to arrive on Talamantera, she told the sergeant. We have no notion of when they might, meaning Tristan might remain in your custody long past the beginning of classes. A pause, an encouraging smile. Smiles tended to get you further than frown when you were a young woman. Unless you had a musket out, anyway. Would it be possible for me to undertake the necessary duty as his captain and have him released to my care? You're behind, Sergeant Huddle replied. Your patron arrived late last night and sent word that Tristan here is not to be released under any circumstances until he arrives. Song breathed in. She did not enjoy looking the fool, which she had just made herself pass as. Hand on the chisel, she reminded herself. If anything, that their patron had finally arrived was fine news. She had many questions to ask him. Would you happen to know when they are to arrive, then? She politely inquired. Before the sergeant could answer, the sound of small commotion in the common room drew their attention. Song barely had long enough to turn before the door was brusquely opened and a man was revealed to her eyes. Shit, Tristan said. It took her a moment for her to recognize the man who entered the room, but only that, and once more she joined the circus. Lieutenant Wen had not lost so much as a thimble of weight since the Dominion, his belly still barely tucked into his black coat and gilet. Her fellow Tianxi was holding a brace of fresh churros through a small folded cloth, one recently bitten into. He was chewing loudly, and did not bother greeting anyone in the room after entering. Sergeant Huddle got to his feet and saluted. "Sir," he said, "I am." Wen raised a finger, silencing the Aztlan officer, then noisily swallowed. Song would have thought at the end of it, but he then wiped his hand on his coat and went looking inside a pocket for his pair of gold-rimmed spectacles. He carefully put them on, resting them on his nose, and Sergeant Huddle opened his mouth again, only to be silenced by a finger again. Lieutenant Wen took another bite of churro and made them all wait in silence as he chewed and swallowed before finally letting out a pleased sigh. "Ah, that's much better," Wen happily said, then turned a steady look on the room. "All right, my morning has now become tolerable enough to suffer through this. Proceed, Sergeant." "Sergeant Huddle, sir," the Aztlan said. "I relieved Sergeant Gentry, who wrote and sent the report you received, but I have familiarized myself with the details. It's a pretty straightforward case," Lieutenant Wen amiably said. "Tristan's a shifty little prick, but it's the 49th that picked their fight and he didn't break any of the Sholomance rules on purpose. I have been told of the situation, so there's no further need for garrison involvement." "As you say, sir," Sergeant Huddle replied. "I'll just need you to sign him out and he's all yours." The fat officer bit into a churro again and Song only barely hit her twitch. Wen's absolute lack of manners, the deliberate flouting of politeness, never failed to infuriate her. Especially in a Tianxi who should know better. "Let's," Lieutenant Wen said. "The others should be waiting for us on Hostel Street by now, and I'm not giving these brats my entire day." Mere minutes later they were on the street, walking back towards their lodgings. Song had never quite settled on whether Lieutenant Wen was Yixan or not, that is, Cathayan of race but raised in a foreign culture. The blue-lipped twins and the Dominion had been that and almost proud of it, but the large officer was more difficult to place. Tristan could not seem to look at Wen without visibly wanting to wince, so Song took it upon herself to break the silence. "A pleasure to meet you again, Lieutenant Wen," she said. "Captain Wen now," the man corrected with a hard grin. Who would have thought those years of formal complaints about Vicente would end up paying off? I was the lone voice of truth ignored by a negligent commander, Ren, a veritable unsung hero. He bit into his churros with relish, letting out indecent noises as he did. Song still could not quite put a finger on his accent in Antigua, which sounded like Erlangi but not quite as throaty. Not from a southern republic, that much was certain. But he didn't sound like he had been raised speaking Machin either. The dialect of the Eastern Republics was too particular to the ear to mistake. If he were Yixan it would explain the manners, she thought. That in him being an asshole, which he manifestly was. "Happy news," Song politely replied. "I must admit I did not expect to see you so soon after the Dominion, much less have you named as our Sholomance patron." "It was a surprise for me as well," Wen replied. "Here I was at the rookery, summoned before a tribunal to determine if I was to be demoted, and instead they cleared me in less than an hour before offering me a position I'd not even applied for. Out on the first boat I was, Mendiso with me." "You must have distinguished yourself during the crisis," Song said. The man bit into his churros again. "Nah," he said, mouth half full. "I'm thinking instead that someone on the obscure committee is it out for your cabal. Since I recommended Tristan here be shot in my report on the trial of ruins, they're hoping I'll get you all killed." Song swallowed. Had she been the one to cause this? She'd heard rumors that a sitting member of the committee ruling over Sholomance had Ken in Jigong, though they were only rumors. A Brascal was finally moved from muteness, which at least distracted Wen from her temporary distress. "Shut, really?" he complained. "That was hardly warranted." "You miss all the public executions you don't ask for," Captain Wen philosophically replied. "Thought I might get lucky and get you tossed into a garrison camp as a compromise, but apparently you're the pet of someone high up in the ranks." "The word you are looking for is pupil," a Brascal sharply replied. There was genuine heat in his eyes, a rare sight. Unlike the dark glee in Wen's, who looked like a man who'd just found a new favorite toy. "Did I hear correctly that Sergeant Mandissa accompanied you?" Song asked, steering away from the explosion. "Might he have been promoted as well?" "No, Mandy's still a sergeant," Wen grumpily said. "I had to pull strings to get her out of the Dominion, too. They wanted to assign me a sergeant from the Talamantera garrison." It was not a long walk back to Hostel Street, and the first stretch of it was spent in silence, so when they turned the corner Song was not surprised to find they were in sight of the Rain Sparrow hostel. Out in the street before it stood the three waiting for them, Mariam, who at last looked properly rested, then the chatting pair of Angharad and Sergeant Mandissa. Both a display of tall, attractive dark-skinned women with a lethal streak to them. Not Song's cup of tea, but she could understand why they were drawing lingering stares even at so early an hour. Wen had finished the entire brace of churros by the time they joined the others, which she would not have thought possible if not for the evidence before her eyes, and seemed in a marginally better mood. A silver lining. When Sergeant Mandissa greeted him. "Done bullying the rooklings." "It's not bullying if they deserve it," he replied. He spent a moment on greeting Mariam, politely, then Angharad with some genuine fondness. Mandissa did the same with them, teasing Tristan with a grin before offering Song her hand to shake. She took it. "Congratulations on being named captain," Mandissa said. "I hear you can get the position formally conferred if you graduate with it." That was Song's aim, yes. Cabalists were outside the general chain of command of the watch, unable to use their ranks to command regulars, but they were also answered directly to the high-ranking officers they were assigned to and could not be commanded by anyone else. It was the best, quickest way for her to be able to take on the kind of work that would restore her family's name. "I will endeavor to live up to the privilege," she replied. "Look at you, saying the striped sayings," the sergeant grinned. "Cute as a button." Song did not scowl, but it was a near thing. She was nearly 20, far past the age for such childish compliments. "All right," Captain Wen said. "I need to brief the brats, and I hear the chimerical opened here, so I'll be taking 2 birds with that stone." "Mandissa?" The tall sergeant wrinkled her nose. "No thank you," she said. "I'll go see if our luggage is there yet, straighten out the rooms." "Much appreciated," Wen said, then turned his eyes on them. He grinned unpleasantly. "Come on, it will be a learning experience." Despite the ominous words, it turned out the chimerical was a little shop tucked away in a corner a mere few streets away from the tall facades of Hostel Street. It looked dingy. The wooden front was stooped and dirty, the sole glass window caked with old dust and the shop sign faded. Once a chimera had been painted in gold, but time had worn away much of the body and all the head save the serpents. The silhouette of the lemur would have been unrecognizable if not for the name of the place, which was writ on the straw welcome mat. It took 2 attempts for Captain Wen to wrench open the thick wooden door, and then the smell wafted out. Strong, bitter and lingering. "This is a coffee house," Song said, genuinely surprised. The Milani drink was wildly popular in Eastleigh and swaths of the Trebian Sea, but it had never gained much of a following in the republics. Tea was bound to too many of the rituals that maintained society. The only one on Talamantera, Captain Wen agreed. "Don't spread the word." She was first in behind the captain, narrowing her eyes at the inside. The chimerical was not any neater there, and still uncomfortably cramped. The entire shop was little more than 3 tables and wool booths and facing a counter behind which she glimpsed the tools to make coffee, roaster, mortar and sundry copper pots for the boiling. Yet the smallness of the shop would not have been so oppressive, Song thought, if the proprietor had not decided to fill it with a multitude of knickknacks. A stuffed alligator hung from the ceiling, a row of green jars with froggy legs floating in preservative were by her head, a large globe whose painted borders matched no existing nation turned slowly, no fewer than 7 Eastleigh dueling spears were put up like trophies. And was that potted nightshade in the corner? With every look she found further cluttering claptrap, none of it arranged sensibly or even in a way that was pleasing to the eye. It was genuinely awful. "Oh," Angharad said, coming in behind her with wide eyes. "How charming." Song was mistress of herself, and so she did not shoot the other woman and betrayed a look. However deserved one might have been. Instead she followed Wen as he claimed the booth furthest in, whose table was currently occupied by a prodigiously fat black cat. It flopped belly up the moment the captain stroked it, purring loudly as Wen showed more affection towards the animal in an instant than she had ever seen him express towards a person not Mandisla over the length of their entire acquaintance. "Good boy," the captain praised. "You're a good boy, yes you are." Mariam, who had caught up to her while Abraskal and Angharad stared at the globe and excitedly discussed something while pointing at a sea that Song was somewhat convinced did not exist, came by her side and shot the feline a skeptical look. "More boo than boy, that one," the signifier muttered her way. Song was startled into a snort, which she politely turned into a cough. "The owner appears absent," she said. "Perhaps we should take a seat, by all means." It was a near thing, but Song refrained from reaching for her blade. The voice came from behind her, the counter where she could have sworn there had been no one. Now there stood a tall old man, his brown hair touched by strokes of gray. Dressed in a slashed rusty jerkin over a high-collared grey doublet and matching hose, a jauntily angled black beret spruced up with an ostrich feather atop his head, the proprietor met her gaze soberly. His eyebrows, she could not help but notice, looked much like the ears of the stuffed Grand Duke owl to his left. Wen abandoned the cat, which meowed plaintively at the withdrawal of belly rubs, and turned to the owner. He looked surprised at the sudden appearance, so perhaps it was common practice. A trapdoor behind the counter, perhaps? There did not seem to be a back room for the proprietor to live in, much less a second story. "Hage," Captain Wen greeted the man. "Wen," Hage replied, his impressive eyebrows rising. "Back from exile, I see. I simply cannot be contained," Wen happily said, then patted the meowing cat's head. "What is this beautiful boy called?" "Mephistopheline," the proprietor replied, smiling broadly. "Prince of Hell, felonious claimant to the throne of Pandemonium." And everyone save Wen went still, as beyond a row of neat white teeth was a maw of fangs. Devil, this Hage was a devil. Mephistopheline broke the silence by leaping down the table and landing with an undignified thump. Song had half expected him to bounce. "The office of opposition will try to assassinate you again if they hear that," Wen amusedly replied. Hage dismissed the words with an indifferent wave. "It will give Asher something to hiss at," the devil said. "Your usual." "Please," Wen said. The devil turned his gaze, placid brown eyes which he was not using, not really, on them. "Your orders?" he prompted. "I'll invite you this once," Wen told them. "Do as you please." "Do you have Euthukil beans?" Angharad hopefully asked. "I'm not a savage, girl, of course I have Euthukil beans," Hage said. "Southern Tsunda, heart of the Riverlands." The Perduri perked up, the words evidently having meaning for her. Song had never heard of Tsunda, though she did know the Riverlands referred to a region near the border between the islands of Euthukil and Malin. It was the wealthiest and most populated part of Euthukil, on account of being furthest from the coast of the low isle and its infamous storms. "Then I would have a cup, if you please," Angharad said. "Unadorned." The devil nodded approvingly, then moved on to the rest of them. "I will have the same as Captain Wen," Mariam volunteered. A cocked eyebrow and a nod. The devil turned his eyes on Song, who forced a smile. "I do not suppose you have tea?" she asked. Hage sneered, turning a look on Wen, who held up his hands defensively. "She's from the old country," he said. "You know how they are." Definitely Yixin, Song thought. It might explain why he appeared to care little about her surname, even though as the 13th patron he was sure to know her bearing. It was no coincidence. "You can have a cup of Totoktan gold, 2 sugars and my contempt," the devil said. "Boy." "Water, thank you," Abraskal dryly replied. Hage stared at him, muttered something about sacking Leergan a 6th time, and dismissed the Sacramontan's existence as he puttered about taking care of the orders. Abraskal sighed and she flicked him a curious look. He scowled. "Coffee is a drug," he told her. "Take it for long enough and you will have headaches if you stop." "You will find no argument from me," Song told him. She could not, the Tiangsi suddenly realized, ever seeing Tristan take so much a sip of liquor without it being pushed on him. The dedication to keeping a clear mind was admirable, and perhaps went some way in explaining how someone whose contract was a glorified coin flip was still alive. His calamity god appeared to be wandering around eyeing the knickknacks, though Song could not spare more than a sneaking look without risking being caught looking. They all squeezed into the same booth, when taking up a side by himself while the rest sat to face him. The captain eyed them with clear displeasure. "I knew that this would be a headache and half when I accepted the position," he said, "but somehow you have surpassed my expectations." He narrowed his eyes. "I haven't even been on this island for a day and I've already had to deal with 2 feuds on your behalf," the captain bluntly said. "Would either of the people who started one of those care to explain themselves?" Abraskal smiled but said nothing, so Angharad gallantly charged into the breach. "It was an honored duel," she said. "And I ended it at first blood." When eyed her balefully. "That's what you say happened," he said. "What I had the patron of the 9th Brigade yelling in my ear about was that you casually crippled and humiliated their Skiratai 2 days before the start of classes." Song had asked her to make an impression, and Angharad had. It was always a pleasure when an order was followed so exceptionally. Only Wen did not look equally pleased. "I had to do a lot of dancing to make it so there wouldn't be a price put on crippling each of your arms this morning," he said. "You're lucky that Lady Nip didn't ask for a high price to get that boy's arm working again." Song cleared her throat, the baleful look turned on her for it. "Lady Nip? The god is running the hospital here," Wen said. She had thought that might be the case. Some surprised looks from the others, a fresh reminder that outside the Republic's gods were not usually considered citizens. "They have Mendaci urgins as well," the captain told the others, "but if you want a miracle, Lady Nit is your port of call. Not that I would recommend using her services too often." Wen then turned back to Angharad. "I argued you were provoked, but still had to pay up so the situation wouldn't get out of hand," he said. "As punishment, the 13th Brigade will not be attending the gathering in Misery Square this afternoon." Song stiffened. Given that every other Shalom student was meant to be there, their absence was sure to be remarked upon. She had meant to capitalize on the repute Angharad had won them, to firm up the alliance with Captain Fair and his brigade and deepen the acquaintance with the 3rd. All those designs were smoke if they were barred from attendance, and after the talk about the 13th would no longer be of their mirror dancers' spectacular victory but instead of the cabal's mysterious absence. "Is it not possible," Song delicately said, "to change that punishment to another, sir? A fine, perhaps? Better to lose brigade funds than brigade connections. The coin would come back but not the opportunities." "You misunderstand me, Ren," Wen told her. "Shalomance had and has only 3 rules. As your patron, I was assigned here to advise you and serve as an intermediary. I cannot, in fact, give you orders or punishments. No one can aside from the garrison and your teachers, and even the latter's authority is limited." He sipped at his coffee again, then set it down. "I negotiated a settlement with the 9th's patron, but you are in no way bound to follow it," he continued, breaking off another piece of shortbread. "What I can tell you is that, if you don't, those remarkably well-connected brats will come after you with all they've got. I gave the 9th a win and mitigated your gains at their expense, so they agreed to keep your troubles schoolyards ones in exchange. No bounties, no leaning on outside connections. You can do with that deal what you will." Song hesitated. "It sounds," Mariam ventured, "like a decent enough bargain. I do not think we want to pick a war so early, no? If the best they can muster is to threaten us with forces beyond them, then we need not bow our heads," Angharad opined. "On the contrary, let us raise the banner and have others opposed to their brigade flock to it. We're not fighting just them or their friends if they put up a bounty," Tristan objected. "We're fighting everyone who needs coin, and I'm guessing that's a much longer list." None of them were senseless in their opinion. It was a heavy fight to be picking so early and against an opponent whose strengths and means were yet unknown to them, but Angharad was not wrong in noting the 9th seemed to be overplaying their hand, which smacked of posturing, of weakness. But there was more to the decision than that. We cannot be the first to openly fight the 9th Brigade, Song evenly said. Using their captain's connections, they want to reign as the princes of Sholomance, which means the first to challenge the rule must be made an example of to cow the rest. They certainly will cross lines to accomplish this, a complication we do not need when we already have so many plaguing us. Angharay's lips thinned. The 3rd Brigade is looking for a cat's paw to hamstring their rivals, Song sharply cut in. We are outsiders brought in so cousins do not come to blows directly, not allies. If they form a coalition against the 9th it will be a different matter, but that is not the situation. The Tiangxi stared down the other woman. Angharay looked away first and Song's face betrayed none of her relief at the challenge ending there. Her command of the situation would slip if her most reliable supporter within the cabal began arguing her decisions too much. She turned to Captain Wen and nodded. "Thank you for negotiating the settlement," she said. As if summoned by the lull in conversation, the devil owning the coffee house appeared with a silver serving plate. Porcelain cups for all, save for a rascal who received his water in a tin goblet. Wen's usual proved to be not only a small porcelain cup of coffee but with a small plate of shortbread cookies sprinkled with some kind of crystalline powder. Sugar? Either way, Mariam immediately helped herself to one and ignored the coffee entirely. Song eyed her own delicate white cup, the coffee within covered with a layer of golden foam. The Totoktan League was, if she recalled correctly, a coalition of city-states nestled against southwestern Eastleigh that the kingdom allowed to exist mostly so it could wage flower wars against it, regularly raiding it for prisoners and loot. Did they grow coffee? She'd had no idea. Hazarding a sip, she found the taste rather mild, a little smoky, and very sugary in aftertaste. Like a sort of syrup. It was warm and not unpleasant, but lacked the attractions of properly prepared tea. Angharay downed her own cup like a soldier putting away liquor, swallowing without a hint of discomfort and smacking her lips afterwards. Song had not had a good look, but what she had just guzzled down had looked not unlike liquid black tar. "Mulaney. What of the situation with the 49th? She asked, setting down her cup. Wen took a sip of his own and sighed in pleasure, then set down the delicate porcelain and broke off a small piece of shortbread to scarf it down. Only after that did he bother to reply. "I know their patron, Dianora Kazel," Wen said. "We were inducted into the Laurels at the same time. She tried to bully me into offering a fine for their wounded, but she had thin grounds for asking. It is their brigade that ambushed me," a rascal evenly said. "Their captain schemed as much from the moment he came to the old playhouse. That Tristan had evaded an entire cabal at the cost of little more than bruising was, admittedly, impressive. The man was not incompetent." "That's what I heard, yes," Wen mused. "They were after some sort of bounty and they were the ones to attack, so as reparations I offered them 1 copper and for Tristan to write an insincere apology letter." Song choked. She had not expected much, given that the 49th was attempting to collect on the head of a member of her cabal and that made peace unlikely, but she had not expected Wen to actively provoke their opponent. She should have known better. Wen was not help, fool of a Ren, he was another disaster in need of handling. "How insincere are we talking?" Tristan asked. Captain Wen opened his mouth to answer but she cut in before he could. "Never mind that," Song said. "There is to be no truce with the 49th, sir?" He shook his head. "And Dianora still ran off with the copper I flipped her when making my offer, so I expect you to retrieve it on my behalf," he solemnly said. "We cannot allow ourselves to be robbed this way, the brigade's honor is at stake. Assaulting a superior officer would be a black mark on her record," Song reminded herself. Mariam, perhaps taking pity on her, cleared her throat and changed the subject. "We were told that our patron would explain how our year at Sholomance is to function, sir," she said. "Given that classes begin tomorrow, I would appreciate that explanation." Wen reached inside his coat, taking out a sheath of papers. He picked one out of the lot, setting the rest aside and unfolding the one he had chosen for them all to see. On it appeared to be the layout of a schedule over 7 days, each split in half. "There are 5 general classes," Wen said. Those are obligatory for you to attend as part of the education common to all Sholomant's students. His finger went to first day, the morning half. Mandate, when said, is a study of the watch itself. The nature of its rights, privileges, duties and functions. A lot of the students with blood in the black will know these things already, some of them, anyway, but it is necessary learning for the likes of you. The finger moved to the second day of the week, morning again. Saga, which as far as I'm concerned is the most important of your classes. It involves both recent history and the study of modern Vesper with its underpinnings. You are to be taught about the world we're sending you into, how it works and how it got to become that way. Third day of the week, still morning. Teratology, when said. The study of monsters, lemurs and lars. Biology, behavior, habitat. How to kill or use them, their weaknesses and wants. Fourth day. Theology, the study of gods. I hear it's to be taught by a navigator, so expect a grasp of basic metaphysics to be thrown in as well. Gloam, glare, ether. Fifth day, morning like all the others. The last, inevitably, is warfare, when said. Not only will you be taught to fight and kill in the ways of our order, you will also be made to study skirmishing tactics on a cabal scale. That leaves the afternoons empty, Song noted. Those belong to your covenant, he said. Sometime today a letter will be sent to your lodgings, outlining where you are to meet tomorrow afternoon and be introduced to your fellow covenanters. Your schedule for the rest of the year will be outlined by your instructors then. And the last 2 days of the week? Mariam asked. Those are yours, when said. You are allowed to take one of the electives if you like, all are taught on 6th day morning, but you will get no special privilege from studiousness save what you learn. He picked out another paper from his sheath, unfolding it and setting it by the first. It was a list, Song saw. The electives. Fundamentals, medicine, seafaring, alchemy, strategy, languages. If you are looking to learn a language in particular, tell me and I'll arrange for it, Captain Wen said. More or less every language spoken in a successor state can be taught, but if you want something rarer it'll depend on whether there is a teacher for it. Slow nods all around. Fundamentals. Tristan asked. It's to catch up your sort, the captain answered. Reading, writing, numbers. Bare bones on the nations, languages and the history of Vesper. Enough of the fundamentals, you won't embarrass the watch when out in the world on our behalf. The Sacramontan hummed but said nothing more. If he had felt insulted by that he hid it well. Professors in the general classes will regularly give you assignments, which you can fail, when informed them. If so, you will be tasked with redoing the assignment. Failure to complete all your assignments to the teacher's satisfaction before the end of the year will see you forced to retake the class the following year. A pause. Fail to complete a class twice and your time at Sholomans comes to an end. A method for giving up failure, Song thought, though perhaps there was a reason for it besides a surfeit of tolerance for incompetence. I was informed that there is to be a yearly test whose failure could also see us expelled, Angharate said. Captain Wen waved it away. Settle in for a few weeks, then we'll talk about the test, he said. You don't have to worry about that for a while. He raised a finger. What you should be worrying about, he said, is that from tomorrow onwards staying in the hostels and dining will no longer be free. Unless one of you is secretly rich, I'd start either making gold or looking for somewhere else to sleep. Song had not exceeded company funds last night, preferring instead to take the measure of Portalazé, but somehow she suspected that the prices for the rooms would be just expensive enough that staying in them would make it difficult to buy anything else. There are other accommodations in Alazé? Angharate asked, surprised. No, Song said with certainty. He means the ruins. There's a city's worth of walls and roofs out there, Wen shrugged. Figure something out. He drank of his cup again and repeated the same ritual with the shortbread. Mariam's own shortbread was long gone, Song noticed, but she had not so much as sipped at her own coffee. Finish your drinks and wait outside, Wen ordered. I need to speak with your captain in private. Ah, Abraskal smiled. The secret strike perks I've been hearing about. It wouldn't be the academy if they didn't stack the deck, Wen easily replied. Go on, then, get going. The thief drained his water and Mariam discreetly hid her full cup behind the empty goblet, ignoring Wen's unimpressed look. Angharad was the first out, speaking her goodbyes, and the rest followed in her wake. The devil named Hage nodded a goodbye from behind the counter, which he was wiping, but did not bother to say anything. After Wen finished another round of coffee and shortbread, he wiped his mouth. Start reading up on the Asphodelrectorate, he said. I'm supposed to be all mysterious about it, but that's most likely where the 13th will be sent for its test. Song nodded, mind spinning. She had looked for a library last night, or at least archives, but there did not appear to be either in Port Elysée. Most likely it would be in Chalomans proper. Now, as an academy candidate you get a carrot and stick handed to you, Wen continued, picking a piece of paper from the pile and handing it to her. Song unfolded it, finding on it a string of 7 numbers. Am I meant to know the meaning of this? She asked. It's your key to the academy account at the bank, Captain Wen replied. From now on, if you hand in the class assignment of one of your K-lists at least 2 days early, the professor will make a note of it and pass it on. At the end of each month you will be allowed to withdraw 10 coppers from the academy account for every instance it happened. Carrot and stick, she silently echoed. Now Song had something to ask of her K-lists and something to reward them with. Something to withhold as well, if they refused. It seemed an easy request to make of them, for some additional funds, because it was. The point, she thought, was to get them used to listening to her. Thank you for the information, she said. Captain Wen shrugged. If any of your lot want to take an elective, try to get the word to me this afternoon, he said. You can register for another week yet, but a fair number have limited places and the only rule is first come first served. I will see to it immediately, Song said. The officer grunted, but did not dismiss her quite yet. He looked almost reluctant when he spoke. Be careful with the professors, he finally said. I hear some might have it out for you over that hole. He gestured vaguely. The dimming, Song flatly said. My family's responsibility for it. That, Captain Wen casually agreed. Song licked her lips. You seem, she said, remarkably unconcerned by that. She did not hope. She knew better, by now. I've got a barbarian heart, Wen told her in Ugentlas Cathayan, as you fine folk from the old country love to say. What do I care for the woes of the republics? Song kept the wince off her face. That was, admittedly, the literal translation of Yixin. Besides, Wen said, I hear they called your grandfather a hero, for that first hour. He refused to collapse the three-legged tower onto the city and spared thousands, didn't he? If something hadn't gone wrong up in Firmament and put out a luminary, he'd be the most beloved man in Jagan. He didn't do it to spare strangers, Song thought, clutching the knowledge in the darkest recess of her heart. He did it because he knew my mother was down there. Her pregnant mother, belly swollen with the second of Song's brothers. It was why she could not hate her grandfather without loving him. If he had not ruined them all, Song would not be alive to despise it. I will be careful, she said, throat tight. Wen studied her for a moment. Finish your coffee before you go, he ordered. Time to compose herself before meeting the others, a kindness. Forcing her to drink something she disliked, an unkindness. Captain Wen laid out in a sentence, she thought. By the time she took her leave she was calm again, hand on the chisel. The others were lounging outside the shop, their chat guttering out the moment she stepped out the door. I have some information, Song announced. And we need to make some decisions. We'll have the free time for it, while everyone else is at Misery Square, Mariam idly said. She did not look at Angharad as she did, but then she did not need to. The Perduri stiffened. Well, Abrascal said, pulling at his collar. I had a thought about that. There is a place I found that I believe we should go to while everybody else is busy. Somewhere I found last night, which I believe could be of use to us. Useful what way? Song frowned. Wen told us to look for a place to sleep, he said. How does a cottage with a garden sound like? Very fine indeed, which meant there was a hidden defect. She was not alone in that understanding. "Now give us the catch," Mariam sadly said. The thief cleared his throat. "It may or may not have once belonged to an archbishop of the Sunless House and be hidden by means of gloam sorcery," a rascal said. Song studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "How large a garden?" she asked, and Tristan grinned. Epilogue Chapter 9. When Song suggested they go to the Emerald Vaults for breakfast and conversation, it was not really a suggestion. She had that look on her face, the one Mariam had learned meant the decision was already made and arguing was at your peril. Not that any of them were inclined to argue, the Azverica least of all. She was still recovering from the inside of that coffee house. Feeling out such a strange shop with her nav had been habit, barely even a conscious decision, but what she'd felt. It had been like standing in the middle of rapids, the currents and the others strong and wild. Lucky her there had not been rocks, else her spirit effigy might well have been wounded. The inside of the chimerical had not been the overly cluttered study of a widowed trader it looked like, but something carefully arranged to stir the ether within. Mariam had known such a thing was possible, of course, at least in principle. She was no Amuthi tinker, but she understood the basics of how ether machinery functioned. Through conceptual symmetry, movement was induced simultaneously in both ether and the material, creating motion or some other expression of energy. The devil of the chimerical, this age, he'd accomplished what would take the finest mechanical minds of Vespa years of research and a fortune in material with a stuffed alligator and potted plants. A sense of odd dread carried her most of the way to the Emerald Vaults in silence, which Tristan took notice of. He slowed his stride as they approached the hostel that was their destination, as if waiting to enter together. "What's wrong?" he quietly asked. Mariam licked her lips. "That coffee house was arranged to confuse signifiers," she said. "I got too curious for my own good." It was impolite, she knew, but Mariam still sent out her nav to feel him out. Tristan always felt the same to her sense, like fire hidden away in a dark bottle, known only through heat and glint. Always warm to the touch. The thief's eyes were narrowed when she found them. "How bad?" She shook her head, heading that off at the pass. "That the devil can do this at all means he could have done much worse," she said. This was slapping a child to teach them manners, not an attack. Not harshly, but firmly enough the lesson would be committed to memory. Tristan slowly nodded. "When already knew Hage," the thief said. "And he said earlier that the chimerical opened here, as if it has existed in places other than Talamanterra. There is more to that devil than we know. This island has more secrets than the sky has stars," Mariam complained. "Come on, let us catch up to the others before Song declares martial law in the name of breakfast." The woman in question was waiting impatiently in the entrance hall of the Emerald Vaults, which was opulent enough. Mariam understood why Song had so wanted them to stay there. When they were escorted into the garden, she noted it was not a Blaskloak but a man in servant's clothes that led the way. They were settled on the edge of a large terrace overlooking a field of purple and silver flowers sewn with lanterns of wrought iron. Everything about this place was irritatingly pretty, even the elegant wooden table they shared covered by an intricate grey tablecloth. A servant was there in a matter of moments, asking their favorite drink and preference and breakfast, freshly baked honey bread, a plate of fruits with buttered white bread or fresh fish on eggs with Sarayan spices. Song seized on the honey bread with her equivalent of unseemly haste, waiting for a long, pointed moment then immediately speaking, while Mariam went for the fruits and the other two for the fish. "I shall soon return with the drinks," the woman smiled, bowing low. Mariam stiffened, though not because of the words. It was difficult to explain the sense to someone who had not forged their nav, not unlike telling a blind man of colors, she suspected. Mother had described it as to raise Evid, the scales sight. To be able to feel weight and worth with the mind's eye, like the fox in the story of the Weeping King. Disloyal as the thought was, Mariam preferred the way Captain Todek had told it. "We are as fish in the river," he taught her, sensing the current by being one with it. And what she sensed in the current was someone trying to mark Angharade Tredegar with their nav. She sent out her own spirit effigy, slapping away the attempt, and the intruder immediately gave ground. Tredegar flinched, batting away from her ear a fly that did not exist, and Mariam's gaze swept the terrace. The garden overlook was hardly crowded, but neither was it empty. 6 other tables were occupied. 2 singles and 4 shared, and though she looked for the guilty party, no one revealed themselves by expression. "Mariam," Song prompted. "Tredegar has the attention of a signifier," she replied. "I drove them away." The Milani stiffened. "Have I been cursed?" she worriedly asked. The Isverica almost rolled her eyes. As if it were so easy to curse someone with gloam. Even the most bare-bone of curses, those that were essentially incipital signs, concentration and manipulation of raw gloam, simply sliding a bubble of gloam somewhere important in a body and hoping it got sick, took at least a few minutes of concentration and refinement if you did not want to be terribly obvious about having done it. "No," Mariam said. "At a guess, they were trying to get an impression of your soul so you would be easy to pick out of a crowd." "And you prevented this," Tredegar slowly said. "Acting in my defense? It was easier to take offense to the surprise than read into it, so that was Mariam did." "My name's on the same cabal list, Tredegar," she coldly replied. Triglav can keep their word too. From the corner of her eye she saw Tristan wince. The noble's lips thinned. "I did not mean to impugn your honor," she carefully said, "but to thank you for your efforts on my behalf." Song was staring at her hard enough it was going to bore a hole into the side of her skull, so Mariam held back and simply grunted in acknowledgement of Tredegar's words. "Well," Tristan said. "That seems as good a segue as any into the first meat we must carve up." Whatever he had been about to say, it was not to be. Not because of the return of someone's impudent Nev or even the servant from earlier, but by a tall and neatly dressed young man in a formal watch uniform. Learganon, Mariam assessed. Mustachioed as was so often their way, fit and dark-haired. He bowed and offered a charming smile. A glance around the table told Mariam none of them had any idea who he was. "My apologies for the boldness of the approach," he said, "but I could not help introducing myself." "Could you not?" Song pleasantly replied. "Your life must be very difficult." She even smiled politely at the end, like she'd not just told him to fuck off, and Mariam swallowed a grin. Song was most enjoyable when someone had just stepped on her toes, as this one had. The man's smile grew a little strained. "I am Captain Tristan Ballister of the 44th Brigade," he bravely continued, then entirely dismissed Song and turned the smile onto Tredegar. Song looked like she was seriously considering strangling him, Mariam noticed, and the grin slipped out. "Do I have the pleasure of addressing Lady Angharade Tredegar?" The Milani's face was like a bland wooden mask. "I am she," Tredegar replied. "Can I help you, Captain Ballister?" "Please," he easily said. "Call me Tristan." Their own Tristan was eyeing the stranger with the faintest of frowns, trying to figure out the angle at work and more than willing to be forgotten about until he had. "I come to congratulate you on your stunning victory last evening, my lady," Captain Ballister continued. His eyes flicked up and down Tredegar's uniform, quickly but visibly, and Mariam almost had to shove her fist into her mouth not to start laughing when she realized what was happening. That dog was not just barking at the wrong tree, it wasn't even the right forest. "Alas," Captain Ballister gallantly said, "I must inform you that you prevailed twice over, for your grace and beauty have triumphed over my—" "No," Song flatly said. The man paused, turning his gaze back to her. "I don't follow," he said. "No," Song repeated. "You do not get to interrupt my morning meal for your attempt to talk my cabalist into dallying beneath her." "Excuse me." Ballister bit back, straightening his back. "Ah, at last we are of a mind," their captain replied. "You are, indeed, excused." The man's cheeks reddened, but when he glared angrily there was not so much as a hint of give in Songren. She stared him down, letting the weight of her words and the ensuing silence wilt him before the eyes of the entire room, because this entire debacle had, naturally, drawn the attention of every last soul on the terrace. If Tristan felt like fire and a bottle to her Nev, then Song was a millstone, heavy, plodding on with a deceptive slowness. It was all too easy to forget its nature was to grind anything it caught to dust. Captain Ballister further reddened at the continuing silence, looking at Tredegar and finding only an unsmiling, expressionless face. He cleared his throat, now unpleasantly aware of the eyes on him. Any longer standing there and he would be a figure of fun among Shalom students by the day's end. "Some other time," Ballister said, then offered Tredegar a nod. "Lady Tredegar." The Milani's lips quirked into something falling short of a smile and she did not answer, letting him retreat with his tail between his legs without once glancing his way. Double Death Brigade indeed, Tristan noted. What with the way Song just murdered him twice. Mariam choked and Song tried to send him a disapproving look, but it was difficult for her to manage one while flattered. Tredegar was the one frowning. How lacking in manners, to approach a lady in such an unsuitable setting, she deplored. I wish we had not been quite so rude in return, but he did seem likely to linger otherwise. If we are to look for allies, Song firmly said, we can do that better than that. The man was now back at his table. He was one of those eating alone, and was carefully not looking their way. Some of the other students were whispering as they shot unsubtle glances his way. The drinks arrived mere moments later, Mariam soon sipping happily at her xocolate. The cool, spicy brew lingered against the roof of her mouth and washed away the last dregs of unease from their visit of the chimerical. Something about meat on the table, she prompted Tristan. He nodded, setting down his cup of pressed oranges. Enemies, he said. I found out several things last night and I expect Tredegar did as well. Shall we take stock? Let us, Song approved. Though we must discuss classes after, as Captain Wen requested we make haste in choosing electives. Tredegar was invited to begin, which was how Mariam learned she had not simply gone around picking honored duels for the pleasure of it. If the man from the 9th Brigade had been stabbed while taking a swing at old acquaintances from the Dominion, then the Izvrika was inclined to forgive the trouble brought to their doorstep. She liked Ferhanda, always had, and Song had once implied to her that Zenzel's contract was a very useful one. Between that and Shalini Gold's deadliness with pistols, even if their fourth cablist was a bag of onions, they would still make fine allies. Captain Ninettle was markedly friendlier afterwards, and intimated the possibility of deeper acquaintance between our cables. Tredegar continued. The other significant approach was Captain Imani Langa. 11th Brigade, the one who honed in on you early, Tristan said, leaning forward. What was she after? Tredegar hesitated for a moment. To recruit me, she said. You say she captains the 11th? She did not mention this. He nodded. Then it appears Lord Kando extended me an offer on her behalf earlier in the night that I ignored, Tredegar noted, then embarrassedly cleared her throat. I also believe some of her interest in me might be of a personal nature. Mariam sought out Tristan's eye. He discreetly mimed a low-cut dress and a shapely figure. Oh dear, the Izvrika grinned. She gleefully caught Song's attention, cocking an eyebrow at the captain. On the Dominion the Tianxi had more than once bemoaned Tredegar's infatuation with the brightly colored snake going by Isabel Ruesta, and it now appeared that Angharade Tredegar was to have enduringly terrible taste. It was the most likable Mariam had ever found her. Song, predictably, grimaced unhappily at the Tredegar's obvious interest. If that woman is not Kryptia, I will eat my hat, Tristan shared. She has had training in tradecraft. It would be unwise to deepen that acquaintance, Song stated, eyeing Tredegar. The Tianxi did not, however, outright forbid it. Going easy on Tredegar again, or worried about giving orders that would not be obeyed? Hard to tell. With Tredegar's part of the tale out of the way, they got to Tristan's and their matters grew convoluted. So Tupac Sickle is spying on us, Tredegar coldly said. I should have expected it. He means to be a foe on Talamanterra as well, then. Or he is assessing how dangerous we would be should we come after him, Song said. He had Ferhanda tracked as well, Tristan pointed out. And more thoroughly than you. That is me leaning Song's way. The same was true of Mariam. Sickle goads others so he can get a read on them, she said. Only then does he risk fights, when he has the lay of the land. I do not think this is any different, only that the nature of Sholomans means he can no longer rely on insults and provocations to learn what he wants. Song nodded her way in approval. Either way, the Tiangxi said, there is no gain in going after him unless we have good reason to believe he will come after us. A reconnaissance of our own might be in order, but no more than that. It is the other threats you've picked out that concern me, Tristan, that a member of the 19th Brigade, this Lady Cressida, helped him bring in his spy. An ally of his? Mariam guessed, then shrugged. Hard to believe, I know, but to some souls strength is preferred to character, Tredegar agreed. That part one do not doubt. It is that Tupac Sickle would make bargains unless there was a great need I find dubious. Mariam conceded the point with a nod. At least on the Dominion, Sickle had only allowed himself to dally with accords when he was a leading force within them. The moment he no longer had his hand on the steering wheel, come the trial of weeds, he hit walk out. It could be the 19th has another stake in this, Song said, sneaking a look at Tristan. The thief hummed, not denying the possibility. Help Tupac's cabal and ours get into a fight, then swoop in when losses are taken to collect on my bounty? He said. It's not a bad plan, if that is what they intend. The Tiangxi sipped at her tea, thoughtful. The meetings you mentioned Captain Firanda has been arranging might be an avenue to learn information on the 19th, Song decided. Gossip between captains is certain to be informative, if not necessarily accurate. I will attend the next one and see what I can learn. Mariam cleared her throat. The 19th could be trouble down the line, but the 49th is a threat in the present, she pointed out. We need to deal with them. I am most impressed you were able to escape them, Tristan, Tredegar said. Some sort of grenade was involved, I understand. The thief licked his lips. It's more complicated than that, he admitted. The roof broke when I blinded their security, and then I fell into what I thought was a basement but proved to be something else. The accidental crossing they detained you for, Song said, silver eyes narrowing. Mariam breathed in sharply. That they what now? She said, seeking Tristan's face for fresh bruises. He always got bruised, it was like the man was made of peaches. You were in jail? She demanded. I was in detainment, Mariam, he replied without batting an eye. That is completely different. She met his gaze, distinctly unimpressed. Did they lock the door? If they locked the door, it was a jail. I'm not going to dignify that with a response, he haughtily replied. Tredegar cleared her throat. If I may ask, she said. Where did you cross into, Tristan? The watchman called it a lair, he said. It is some sort of place in the ether, an impression made by a particular time, and supposedly there are several here. The one I visited is called the witching hour, a dream of the night the watch invaded Talamanterra. Eyes went towards her at his words, even Tristan's, as save for Song she suspected none of them knew much of anything about metaphysics. Mariam herself only knew so much, having come to Akeller teachings later than most. Besides, she must acknowledge that the navigators were not as concerned with the academics as the Peeling Society. Signifiers taught mostly in practicals, but that practical knowledge was admittedly still be more than anyone else at the table would. Mariam bit her lip, worrying it as she chose her words. An impression was one of those concepts that could not easily be explained without drawing on several other concepts. Do you know what an ether well is? She finally asked. Hesitant nods all around. Song was the one who volunteered a concrete answer. It is a naturally occurring phenomenon where ether flows into reality in great quantities, she said. Talamanterra is one such place. The Asverika nodded. A simplification, but essentially correct. Ether is both a realm and an element, Mariam told them. The word is used to refer to both interchangeably, which can be confusing, but the simplest way to put it is that the material world has an immaterial mirror, which we understand as the realm of ether. She licked her lips. The realm is called that way because it is made up a single element, ether, and that element leaks into the material world through places we call ether wells. Mariam found the attentive gazes a little unsettling. Even Tredegar looked heatful. Particularly Tredegar, honesty compelled her to admit. You will have heard from all sorts that your emotions taint the ether, which might have you wondering how anger at stubbing a toe can reach such an immaterial realm, she said. The simplified answer is that your soul straddles the line between material and immaterial, reaching into both. Awakening her blind soul into an Ev, a soul effigy, had been the first step on Mariam's path to being able to wield the powers of the world. To weave gloom without first doing this was possible, but it would condemn one to petty tricks and ugly death. We do no matter much, Mariam told them. A single soul's emanation is nothing, a drop of water in a sea. It would take thousands of deaths either all at once or in the same small place for an impression to be made on the ether and something like a god come into existence in the immaterial. She grimaced. Only the rules are different near an ether well, Mariam said. There is physical ether here, the element leaked into the material, and that is much more susceptible to impression. Enough a sufficiently bloody battle, like the invasion of Talamanterra, would do the trick. So Tristan did not journey through time. Tredegar slowly said. Only tread the grounds of this. Dream of the past? There is no such thing as going back in time, Mariam firmly said. Only forward, and ether cannot even do that. Besides, there have long been arguments about whether what gloom does is actually. She paused, breathed in. Prune the irrelevant, Mariam reminded herself. It was frustrating, like having to explain the intricacies of cliff climbing to someone who had never so much as seen a hill. She had not realized until now how much of what she took for granted relied on knowledge uncommon, how deep the teachings of the Aquiller guild truly ran. No, he did not journey through time, she repeated. The impression, the layer, it is real in the same way that your soul is real. But it is like a memory, a remembrance of what was. The complication here is the physicality of it all. She mulled the explanation, sliced off the unnecessary like peeling an apple. A layer is real like a soul is real, she finally said, because it also straddles the line between the material and the immaterial. But my body was there, Tristan slowly said. Wasn't it? She wiggled her hand. When you walk around this terrace, does your soul also move? She said. He coughed. Yes? No, she said. Your soul is where you are, always, with no movement being involved. In the layer, the reverse was true, your soul was the one moving around and your body was where the soul was, always, without movement being involved. But in the same way that if you got stabbed, your soul would be unharmed. If he had been wounded inside the layer, his body would be unmarked, Tredegar said. She nodded. Should someone get decapitated in there, they will very much die, Mariam took pains to make clear. But their corpse will not be headless, the death will come from harm to the soul. The Asverika leaned back into her seat. It is why the place where you entered is not the same where you came out, she told Tristan. You entered the layer through a weakness in the material, slipping in, and after your soul moving around some you slipped out by another, and since soul and body are one, it was as if he had been transported from one place to another, Song murmured. That is difficult to believe, I know, she admitted. If it helps, layers are exceedingly rare and near unknown outside the environs of other wells. Song shook her head. Potentially useful, she said. A way to move around the city unseen. She winced. That would be extremely dangerous, Song, Mariam said. Flesh heals naturally but souls do not. They have to be mended by hand, and even then they will never be the same. The Tiangsi looked displeased but did not argue. Mariam foresaw in her near future a thorough questioning on the risks and possibilities of traveling through a layer, until Song was satisfied she had been either right or wrong. The watchmen that found me were worried, Song, Tristan reminded. They tested me with the brigade seal to find out if I was possessed by Amara. Mariam whistled. There were dealmakers here? They should have been warned the moment they came off the boat. Nasty things, she said. We should be very careful if there are some on Talamanterra. Their kind lingers near boundaries to steal bodies and minds. If there truly were several layers in Port Elysee, their presence made sense. They'd hate the Grand Orrery, but having so many thresholds around would be like a honey to their sense. They are sort of Lemure? Song asked. Natural other intellects that failed to become gods, Mariam mentally corrected. Or signifiers that crossed lines. Only both of those answers would have begged questions she could not or would not answer, so instead she nodded. It was close enough, practically speaking. A pair of servants arrived with plates of food, setting them down with nary a sound, and by unspoken accord the conversation came to a halt. Mariam eyed her silver plate with surprise, as it bore more of a bounty than she had expected from an island tucked away in the middle of nowhere. Oranges and pomegranates, figs and persimmons. Even a mango diced into artfully arranged little cubes, which had her nostalgic. She'd been a fiend for mangoes as a girl, her father's haul has kept those large baskets of them. More than once she was switched for a pilfering sum, hiding up in the branches of the oak in the courtyard to gorge herself on the sugar of flesh like some squirrel. Only Mother withering the oak with a touch of gloam had broken her of the habit. She dug in with gusto, though she spared a few looks for the plates of the others. Song's honey bread looked appetizing enough, she thought, the Tianxi methodically eating it piece by piece while drinking sips of her tea to extend the meal. Yet Mariam could not countenance how the other two might be so eager to eat eggs with fish, of all things, and those reddish spices aplenty. Mariam had never taken to fish, which she had rarely had as a girl. Volcesta, the town of her birth, was in a valley commanding passage from Dubrick to the Sky Road, so they had eaten more like the hill folk than the kings of the coast. Fruit and cattle, not fish and wheat. Before the Milani began bringing their own cattle over from across the sea, her father had grown rich trading them sheep and goats at the forts on the shore. Mariam was forcefully ejected from that train of thought by the sight of Tristan cutting into his eggs, trailing yolk all over the fish and slathering a piece of it in the yellowness. He caught her gaze and raised an eyebrow, raising his fork as if to offer a bite, and the Ezvereka forced a smile when shaking her head. She would try a mouthful of the tablecloth before subjecting herself to that. Busying herself with her plate, she polished off the filling meal of fruits and bread, then leaned back to sip anew at her xocolatl until Song finished the last of her honey bread. She was amused to notice that Tianxi had only drunk half of her cup of tea, everything carefully measured. Sometimes Mariam thought that, if Songren got shot in the gut, it would be the messness of it that troubled her most. Setting down her green tea after one last sip, Song cleared her throat. "I intend to take an elective class," she informed them. Mariam cocked an eyebrow. "You knew that before ever seeing the list, didn't you?" she accused. She had yet to trace the borders of what the Tianxi did and did not know of Sholomance. Sometimes it seemed she was in on every secret, others that she was just as lost as the rest of them. "My uncle recommended that I take strategy," Song admitted. "It is a study not only of stratagems but also of warfare on battalion scale and larger. Watchmen inducted into the academy in the traditional way are taught something similar." Tristan squinted at her. "How large is a battalion?" he asked. 600 to 1,000 soldiers, the Tianxi replied without missing a beat. "It is the most common kind of independent detachment under the watch, led by officers of commander rank." Song's lips quirked in a subtle hint of satisfaction, as they often did when she was asked questions she knew the answer to. Mariam, though, thought she had replied too quickly. Song had answered by rote, regurgitating something she had read off a page or heard from a superior officer. It might even be true, but the Ezvereka knew better than to trust anything a power like the watch wrote and said about itself. The foot put forward for everyone to look at was never the limping one. "Ambitious," Tredegar said, and she sounded approving. "Do you intend to seek a field command under the garrison after your time in the Cabal?" "If the opportunity arises," Song acknowledged. "Such positions are fiercely fought over, however, so it is more likely I will eventually raise my own free company." Tristan let out an interested noise at that. Mariam would admit to some surprise, as though it was true that free companies were largely free of the conclave's edicts. She had not thought the Sacramontan particularly fond of Song's captaincy. They would grow into it, and each other, but it would take time. "That sounds like it would require a great deal of funds," he said. "How do you intend to secure them?" Ah, it was Mariam's mistake. Her viper had only smelled coin and grown curious about what treasures Song might have tucked away. The Ezvereka was as well, admittedly, so she cocked an inviting eyebrow at their captain. Cleverly, Song calmly replied, and changed the subject. "Have you given thought to an elective, Tristan?" The thief nodded. "Medicine," he said. Mariam made a noise of surprise. She was not the only one, for though Tredegar was pleased, as if she had a right to approve or disapprove of his decisions, Song's face was forcefully even, and that way it tended to be when she was keeping emotion off it. "I would have thought alchemy your pick," Mariam admitted. "I got much more use out of the medicine than the poisons." "On the Dominion?" Tristan shrugged. "And unless one of you intends to take that class." Mariam did not, and Song had already her eye on a more ambitious track, which left Tredegar. The hint flew right over the other woman's head, and instead she beamed at Tristan. "It is a worthy and respectable occupation to be a physician," she told him. "People trust doctors with all sorts of things they shouldn't," Tristan happily agreed. "Besides, if I pull out painkillers most will assume I'm a savant pick instead of Cryptia. That ought to make it easier to get around." That beam was wiped right off Tredegar's face, and if it happened to find its way onto Mariam's instead, then it was mere happenstance. Song, at least, looked somewhat impressed. "It is a decent enough pretense," she said. "It might not last long, however, if you are asked about your preferred field of study. The Peeling Society is one of scholars. My precise field of study is avoiding being caught out in such a manner," Tristan mildly replied. Tredegar cleared her throat, which Mariam was mildly grateful for. It distracted the two before the deceptive mildness could be turned into something sharper by Song's continued prodding. The Tianxi did not mean it an insult, she was poking holes so they might be filled with something stronger, but Tristan would only see it as a stranger doubting his competence. Or worse, trying to dig up his secrets. "You have to trade with him." Mariam had understood that from the moment a strange boy approached her in the Bluebell's belly. Anything else he would see as tax, and the infant zones had taught him to hate those to the bone. "I was told you had poisons on the Dominion but, given the source, had not put stock in the accusation," Tredegar said, frowning. "How did you use them?" And there went Mariam's gratitude. Though it did seem like an unusual blunder for Tristan to speak of poison before the Mulaney, so she glanced at him with a frown. The utter lack of a wince on that face was reassuring. "As bait for lupines, and I fed a dying hollow a large quantity of Volcian, you knowing the air of it and would eat him," Tristan easily replied. "Not a single lie spoken. You prepared that well in advance, you rogue," she fondly thought. How long had he been waiting to sow that seed? "I am unfamiliar with Volcian, you," Tredegar admitted, taking the bait. "It is a poison for lemures and Lars," Tristan elaborated. "It did not kill the Heliodorine beast, I had nowhere enough for that, but it did make it go blind, which let us trick it into its doom." And what a coincidence, Mariam sadly thought, that the explanation of what the poison was would so neatly dovetail into a reminder of his most visible and selfless act of valor on the Dominion. That would feed right into the Mulaney obsession with equating action and character, the rotten disease teaching them that only good people did good things and only bad people acted badly. Tristan had done good things, so he could not be bad. And he had not, by a sane woman's reckoning. Mariam considered every death dealt by his hand deserved. She would not have kept silent otherwise. "I heard that O'Cutlan was killed by poison, but that the dealing hand was Vanessa's," Tredegar slowly said. "Did she?" "She plundered my stores without asking," Tristan flatly replied. "Though I would have flavored his drink without a second thought had she asked. He was a brutal thug and half the reason she was forced to take the trials besides." His hand twitched, like he had forced himself not to reach for the brass watch he'd inherited from the old woman. For all that he liked to pretend himself beyond grief or regret, she had never seen the thief without it. Tredegar nodded, thoughtful, and the storm clouds went away. Song had watched them all the while, not saying a thing even though their captain had come across just enough to undo Tristan's nimble footwork had she so wished. But she had not, because Song knew that if Tristan was made to leave then Mariam would leave with him. So the Tianxi had kept silent and let it play out. But she never lied either, so that if this all blows up Tredegar will find her easy to forgive. There was always an angle at work, with Song. She was not angry of it. It was a desirable quality in a captain. "I intend to take seafaring, myself," Mariam said, half so they might move on in full. Song eyed her curiously. "You dislike ships," she said, and it was not a question. "You would too, if you had seen hundreds of prisoners dragged into their holds never to return," Mariam thought. "I am a navigator," she replied. "It is not a rule among the Aquila Guild that a member should be capable of, well, navigating, but there are certain expectations nonetheless. The navigation a signifier was expected to be capable of was that of gloam storms, preventing the ship and crew from being swept away and swallowed by the dark, but since many of her guildsmen spent most of their career on ships, it was common practice for them to be capable of traditional navigation as well. It also allowed them to charge a higher price when hired onto trading ships to ward off gloam storms, by far the most regular and lucrative work the free companies of the watch undertook. Sailing on merchantmen up and down the Tower coast was not the kind of contract that brought in a fortune all at once, like killing an old god or digging out a cult, but it was solid, constant and largely riskless income. Those contracts were the bread and butter of free companies and why the name navigators was better known than a killer out in Vesper. "It is a worthy thing to overcome one's discomfort by effort," Tredegar offered up. No condescension was meant, Mariam knew that. It still felt like she was being patted on the head by a woman who thought herself her better. Swallowing the sharp reply on the tip of her tongue, the blue-eyed Isvereka forced civility. "What elective are you considering?" she asked. Song's grateful look stung. It was not unreasonable of her to dislike Tredegar. She had a right if she so wished. "I am inclined not to take one," the Milani said. Of course she was, Mariam derisively thought. Angharad Tredegar was already perfect, what was there to improve? "Should my hand be forced I might learn some Ratrava or Sensen," Tredegar continued, "but before having a grasp on the demands the Skiratai Guild might make of my time I am reluctant to make such a commitment." That was, the Isvereka unhappily conceded, not all that unreasonable. Somehow she doubted the militants would have the most intellectually demanding of classes on the island, but there was little doubt they would be the most physically brutal. Captain Wen mentioned that we yet have a week to pick an elective, but that there are no guarantees seats in them will remain, Song told them. "Keep that in mind before giving me your decision." His request was that I pass him the choices as swiftly as possible, so if any of you are certain. She trailed off, inviting answer. Mariam was sure him told her as much. If she was to ever sail a cutter she would need to be trained and her discomfort was nothing in the face of necessity. Tristan committed to training as a physician heartbeat after, and though Song did not mention it Mariam saw her scribble her own name by the strategy class on the list. Tredegar decisively maintained her indecision, bold bravery that closed the matter of classes for now. "We should take stock of our funds," Mariam suggested after. "I think we could all use a little coin to burn so we might get our affairs in order before classes begin." "Ah," Tristan said, "that remind me." He went fishing inside his cloak, removing a slip of paper which he then handed her under the puzzled gazes of the others. On it was written the number 112 in an ink seal, crossed keys inside a circle, had been stamped at the end. "Your cloak," he said. "They wouldn't let me keep it in detainment, so I paid for it to be kept in a warehouse. The Farrago warehouse, they called it." She beamed at him. With a hood to pull down, she might be stared at less in the streets. "The same warehouse where my uncle's gift is being kept," Tredegar noted. "We can settle both affairs as once." The Milani then eyed her with surprise. "I did not know you had bought a cloak, Mariam," she said. The Isvereka bared her teeth. "At that price, why, it was robbery," she replied. Song cleared her throat. "It seems to me that the both of you should head there while Tristan and I—" She was interrupted by the sound of wood scraping on tiles obnoxiously loudly. Mariam turned to see someone stealing a chair from the nearest table and wedging it between her and Song, back first. The one doing it was one of the most handsome men she had ever seen. Clear Gannon, his dark hair going down to his neck, smooth-tanned skin and striking blue eyes. Closely shaven and meticulously clean, the man's regular uniform drew the eye to lithe muscles and broad shoulders. The stranger sat, facing them and leaning his elbows against the back of his chair, and though his teeth were perfect Mariam could not help but think they looked sharp as knives. "This is no way to make acquaintance, sir," Tredegar coldly said. "We are already acquainted," the man said. "By name, if nothing else." He leaned over and casually took Song's cup, bringing it to his face to take a sniff and then making a little moe before setting back down on the tablecloth. "Jagong green?" he said. "Insipid." Before the baffled Tianxi could call him to task for it, he smiled. "Captain Sebastian Cameron," he introduced himself. "9th Brigade." Ah, Mariam thought. Shit. It was going to be one of those conversations, wasn't it? The princeling of princelings glanced at Tredegar. "You struck my man last night, made a fool of him," Captain Sebastian said. "Unbecoming modesty," Angharate Tredegar replied without batting an eye. "I assure you, he hardly needed my help at all." "That's funny, it is," he chuckled. "You're funny, Tredegar." He cocked his head to the side. "Were you like that, before they butchered your family and put a price on your head?" he asked. "Or maybe you're one of those sorts that put a smile on grief." The Perdiri went very, very still. Sebastian Cameron kept smiling. "My aunt, she says only a fool picks a war in dark," he said. "So, I looked into you all while your fat waddler of patron came to make terms with her." Deftly taking a small silver spoon, he rapped it against the side of Song's cup, then pointed it at Mariam. The worst signifier on the aisle. Her teeth clenched. It stung all the more to know that he may, in truth, be correct. The spoon moved to Song. The most hated surname under heaven. To Tristan. Nobody. Only then did he look at Angharate again, no longer smiling. And Angharate Tredegar, surely the costliest niece in the entire history of Vesper, Captain Sebastian Cameron said. "You are the only one here worth a second glance here, Tredegar, and by all indications you happen to be the worst fool of the lot." The captain rapped the silver spoon against the table pensively. "Vexing," he decided, "is what this is. Chasing you out of Sholomance is pointless. Who takes heed of a broadside fired into a sinking ship? On the other hand, you manhandled Musa last night and then went about swaggering about at my brigade's expense." Sighing, he rapped the spoon against the table again. Like punctuation. "My Tia agreed on terms with Captain Waddles, so I will heed them out of respect for her," Captain Sebastian said. "You must be disciplined, of course, but after that I wash my hands of this." The disdain in the last word, spoken as he eyed them all, was a heavy thing. "I advise against coming to my attention again," Sebastian Cameron said. Song's eyes were cold. "And what will happen," she said, "if we do?" "No," Mariam thought. "That's what he wants you to say, Song. So he can make his threat." The man laughed. "How bold the illusion of safety makes even the least of us," he mused. "You are not protected, Songren. It would be for the best you shed that particular delusion before it gets you hurt." Sebastian Cameron pushed back the chair and rose to his feet, contemptuously tossing the spoon onto the tablecloth. 27, Rain Sparrow Hostel, he said. "Your room, yes? It will be empty when you return." The captain of the 9th Brigade smiled. "This time I choose to leave the 13th Brigade with the clothes on its back," Sebastian Cameron said. "That is the last mercy you'll get from me." Then he beamed at them, nodded a goodbye like an old friend, and walked away whistling a jaunty tune. They watched him go in silence. Even after he left the terrace, not one of them spoke until at last Song broke the silence. "Tristan," she said. The thief turned her way. "Song? It appears we'll be heading to your cottage early," she said, "for we are in need of new accommodations." Tobe continued. "Thanks for listening.